We're here on a street known as the Via del Sudario. It means the way of the shroud because there's a copy of the Holy Shroud of Turin here in a small church on this street. Now, the Possessor route is a route that was well documented often in terms of the things that happened along it, the costumes of the processors, but there's no actual map that shows us precisely where the route went. And so we have to a little bit interpret both the urban fabric and the event in order to sort of discern where it went when things get a little bit more confusing and when things are very different than they were back in the 16th or 17th or 18th century. Now, as we just went on that little stretch of Corso Vittorio Emanuele, we're on a small part of the Possessor route, the Via Papalis, that actually corresponds to a main street today. But that street, Corso Vittorio Emanuele, is, as we've said, a street essentially realized in the latter part of the 19th century after the unification of Italy when Rome became the national capital and the city grew exponentially. Here, in this case, we're on a street that doesn't seem like very much compared to Corso Vittorio Emanuele. In fact, by some people's definitions, it might almost be an alley. But it's my conjecture, and others as well, that this street was in fact a stretch of the Via Papalis, the Possessor route, because it pointed directly towards the Church of the Gesù, which obviously situated itself there for a very specific reason. We also came around, though, the Church of the Theatines, San Andrea della Valle. And that church was built over a small stretch of this street. A little bit of the evidence of that is still available because the doors that mark essentially the end of the nave of that church extend from one side to the other and more or less correspond to the route of the street. The church itself, the original small church on the site, was essentially half the length of the current church and would have been to this side, to the south essentially of that street. But the reason we think that this was a stretch of the Possessor route is that a number of important things happen here. First of all, that the Theatines placed themselves at the juncture. Now, you would have had to come around the Church of San Andrea della Valle, and the old maps show a little bit of buildings in that open space between the church and the current palace. But having negotiated that corner, you would have been pointed to the door of the essentially mother house of the Theatine order. Now, the Theatines were great rivals of the Jesuits, and here they are essentially pinning down two ends of the Via del Sudario. The Theatines, at the beginning of this stretch for us, have essentially become a kind of nexus point, a point at which we've reoriented ourselves. We've been targeting their dome, we've moved around their facade, and now we come around to their mother house. So when we were talking about the relics at the Gesù, we talked about the Casa Professa, the residence that was attached to the Gesù, the mother church of the Jesuits. Here, the Theatines' house is set back from the street, set back from the facade of the church, and set along this edge of the Via del Sudario. So that's one clue that we have that this was obviously an important street. You were meant to come back here with their grand door and the entrance to their essentially residence palazzo. We've also put ourselves here right next to a palace that was one of the most important palaces surviving from the High Renaissance in Rome. It's based on a palace by Bramante that's been destroyed, but it's a very close imitator of that palace. It has a heavy rusticated ground floor and columns on the second story, or the first story by European definitions. And that particular combination of rustication and refinement up above signifies that this is an important palace for an important personage. And this, in fact, is the palace of the Caffarelli, who were very close to the Holy Roman Emperor Charles V. Now, the Holy Roman Emperor is one of the motivations for the building of the Campidoglio, as we've heard, because his arrival in Rome on a triumphal procession essentially made the Campidoglio look bad because it was so shabby. And the Pope at that time, Paul III, wanted to essentially redesign the piazza in order to create a more dignified setting for eventual returns of popes and other dignitaries to that site. So when this Emperor Charles V came to Rome in 1536, he actually stayed in this palace. Of all the palaces in Rome, he stayed in this one, the Palazzo of the Caffarelli. And he rewarded the Caffarelli for their hospitality by assigning them land on the Campidoglio behind the Palazzo dei Conservatori. So that's another clue that this was a very important street because such an important family and an important palace and one of the most important personages of 16th century Europe stayed here on this street. Now, as I mentioned, it's also called the Street of the Shroud, the Via del Sudario. The Shroud is one of the most important famous relics in the world. It's the Shroud of Christ that's kept in Turin. And Turin was essentially the capital of Piedmont. Now, Italy was composed of many different nation states and small city-states that eventually have become agglomerated into the nation of Italy as we know it today. But they were very much independent, autonomous political entities. And as we've seen, even the Florentines had their own national church here. So the Piedmontese had their own church here, and in that church they had a copy of the shroud, their most important relic. And that's again another sign that this important foreign community places themselves here and places this image of their most famous relic on this street that's part of the papal way, the way to the induction of the Pope as Pope at his cathedra in the Lateran. There's another church a little farther down that's the Church of the Flemings, an important national community from the north of Europe that also situated themselves here. And that again suggests that we're on a route where everyone wants to be here if they can on this important street leading eventually to the Campidoglio and on to the Lateran. And then of course we look down this street. Now as we look down this street, after it seems to end here, it opens into a wide space. But again, that's a fundamental transformation of this urban context in the late 19th and the first decades of the 20th century. In the first decades of the 20th century, a whole block of buildings was demolished and they excavated a whole series of early Republican and early imperial structures that are in an area now known as Largo Argentina. All of that was unavailable in the era that we're talking about from the 16th through the 18th century. So we have to imagine that this street, this corridor, this almost alley, continues all the way to the facade of the Gesù. And seeing the facade of the Gesù at the end of the street clues us to the fact that the church itself finds itself there because it was at such an important juncture and as a terminus to the street. And it's fascinating to think about these two, in some ways, most powerful religious orders of the 17th century in Rome locking down the two corners of the street and rivaling each other in a way. They rival each other by architecture. They rival each other in their facades and their interior decorations, and they rival themselves in terms of their prestige on this important papal route.